extraordinary news on the international scene at the same time. So President Xi and China making major diplomatic overtures across the world that are both upstaging the US and really just showing us increasingly on a day-by-day slow basis of really what a return to multipolarity is going to look like. So let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. Xi Jinping is now announcing a plan to speak with President Zelensky for the first time since the Ukraine war broke out. This is going to follow the Chinese leader's meeting with Russia's President Vladimir Putin next week, making China one of the major interlocutors currently between Moscow and between Ukraine. This was previously a role that France had taken. There were some indications that maybe the Indians would step in and do it. But with China stepping in, it is an extraordinary moment for a couple of reasons. Number one, almost nobody actually maintains relations with both countries. But two, this would be a huge step in Beijing's basically current want to be the international peacemaker. We're going to talk a little bit about the peace deal that they've brokered with Iran and Saudi Arabia, or at least restoring of diplomatic relations, not necessarily a peace deal, but to think about what level of legitimacy that would bestow upon them on the world stage is actually extraordinary. And there was a really interesting moment that happened yesterday. There's an Atlantic Council fellow. For those who don't know, the Atlantic Council is kind of like as neo-lib as it gets, protecting the Atlantic Alliance.
The heartbeat of the blob.
It is the heartbeat of the blob. That's a great way to put it. As foreign policy establishment thinking goes, like that's where it is. And it was a scholar there who is very much of that mind, and she's like, "Hey, I'm in India. I don't think we in the West really understand how little the European and US rhetoric about autocracy versus democracy is not landing at all in South Asia." She was like, here in India, they don't want to hear it. They don't care. A huge portion of the global South that we've talked to, spanning from Lula to people in Japan, South Korea, and elsewhere, are like, I don't want to hear all your talk about democracy. Right. And even the Indians were like, listen, we're not saying that what happened is good, but you guys expanded NATO and these things. So the point is that they're willing to look at both sides very equally.
They see it very differently.
And
remember we covered that poll that showed that basically only the US, even Europe wasn't really buying the it's democracy versus authoritarianism. Even they felt like, okay, this is more about national interest. And certainly the rest of the world does not view this conflict in the way it has been framed to the American people.
China is exploiting that void by basically embracing a realpolitik view of everything. And this is to their benefit for a variety of reasons. Number one, of course, they are currently on the verge of making a decision on whether to send lethal aid to Russia, basically to help them fight the war in Ukraine. It would be a major development for them to do so. It would definitely open up and change a lot of the Russian supply problems that they have, and it certainly would have some impact there on the battlefield. But they're doing it at the same time that they are also have been facing international condemnation. Remember also that China's approval rating worldwide dropped dramatically because of COVID. Everybody blames them for COVID, rightfully, I think, in my opinion. We'll cover our poll later in the show about it. Everyone thinks it. Basically, a super majority of Americans are like, yeah, it's a lab leak. And that's in America, that's probably low compared to the rest of the world. We're like, obviously, it's a lab leak. So they need to try and shore up their international support. Second, they want to define the world in their way. Why? Because then if there was ever a major showdown over Taiwan, they would have a lot more international capital built up in the diplomatic system than they currently have right now. So look, the call is not yet been announced. I do think it will happen for a very specific reason. Let's go ahead and put this next one up there on the screen. It's because the Chinese proposed a peace plan about a couple of weeks ago, on the first anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Effectively, the plan would just freeze the battlefield where it is right now with some negotiation over parts of eastern Ukraine and would bring the two sides together. The Chinese, they like to frame everything in terms of mutual respect, and by that, really, they mean their definitions. But they say, quote, all parties must stay rational and exercise restraint, avoid fanning the flames, aggravating tensions, prevent the crisis from deteriorating further or spiraling out of control. They want to step in and cast themselves as the peacemaker. What was also very important is, despite the fact that Zelensky, anytime somebody like Elon is like, hey, I'm not so sure about this, maybe we should have a peace plan, he actually responded very positively to it. You know why? Because he knows that if he were to reject it out of hand completely, the Chinese would be like, okay, well, if you're not even willing to negotiate at all, then we're just going to send weapons to Russia, and then you guys will be defeated holistically on the battlefield. So the point is that they actually put Zelensky in a bind and have gotten him to a point where he has said, I am willing to discuss this with the Chinese. So he opened up that ground saying, I want to speak to President Xi. A lot of people in the West were like, Zelensky's calling Xi's bluff. I'm like, is it a bluff? Because maybe they actually do want to broker this. It would be the diplomatic coup of the century if they were to bring this conflict to an end. It would upstage and humiliate the United States. It would make a Chinese takeover of Taiwan 10 times more possible, because just in terms of the legitimacy, in terms of the allies that they would get through that, in terms of the way that Asia would start to look at the conflict, and let's be honest, global public opinion-wise, they would be striking at the core of what most people want. Not necessarily here in America, although increasingly I think more so, but specifically all across the world of people who are like, I'm not buying this US framing of this conflict.
I think it's very positive if China wants to play the role of peacemaker. God knows that somebody needs to, and the U.S. has absolutely abdicated their ability and desire to play that role from early in this conflict, when they decided that our interests were in continuing the war in order to be a check on Russia, rather than trying to push the parties to the negotiating table to bring the conflict to a close and end what has been an absolutely devastating war, certainly first and foremost for the Ukrainian people, but also for the world in terms of energy prices, in terms of food prices, in terms of global instability. So I absolutely welcome this role for China. I hope they are approaching it in good faith. I think the fact that there is any receptiveness on the side of Zelensky is incredibly noteworthy, because it was interesting, Saagar, when the peace plan from China, quote unquote, was first introduced, announced, et cetera, the official response from Ukraine was very dismissive. But when Zelensky himself was asked about it, he was actually much more receptive. Now, NATO, on the other hand, is not impressed. They say China doesn't have much credibility. This is the NATO Secretary General. China doesn't have much credibility because they've not been able to condemn the illegal invasion of Ukraine. But in fact, China is on the verge, potentially, of taking some more aggressive and clear-cut steps to back Russia. At that point, their ability to play any sort of peacemaker role is going to be dead. But they haven't done that yet. And in fact, the fact that they have kept a good relationship with Russia and haven't totally killed their relationship with Ukraine actually enables them to occupy this space. So I think it's actually kind of the polar opposite of what the NATO Secretary General has said here. Yes, it was an illegal invasion of Ukraine. We're not afraid of saying that here. But the fact that China hasn't said that and hasn't really pissed off the Russians in that way actually gives them a chance to be useful here. It's important to keep in mind as well, prior to the war, China was actually Ukraine's biggest trading partner. So it's not like there isn't any relationship there. There are deep and longstanding important ties, economic ties, which also underscores that the way China has approached their foreign policy, or their approach to imperialism, you might say, has been less through, we're going to put bases everywhere, we're going to enforce it with military might, and more through economic ties and cooperation, and using those ties as a form of leverage and coercion. So, certainly they have a lot that they can work with here in terms of those ties with Ukraine and obviously with Russia.
And the reason why this is part of a bigger campaign is, let's put this next one up there on the screen. Our friend Trita Parsi talking about how Saudi and Iran normalization of relations is a huge deal, not just because of the positive repercussions that it could have in the region from Lebanon to Yemen, but because it was mediated by China and not the United States. As he lays out here, Saudi and Iran tensions have had ups and downs in the last 40 years, but this is the first time they've ever agreed to lower the temperature through Chinese mediation. By not taking sides, China emerged as a player that can resolve disputes rather than merely just sell weapons. Unfortunately, the U.S. has adopted an approach to the region that has disabled it from being a credible mediator. Too often, Washington will just take sides in conflicts, become a co-belligerent, as in Yemen, which then reduces its ability to play the role of peacemaker.
Yeah.
While many in Washington view China's emerging role as a mediator as a threat, the reality is that more of a stable Middle East where Iranians aren't at each other's throats and Saudis also benefits the United States. So I definitely think he is right. And the reason, though, that I'm trying to take a step back is, listen, all states, I am a real, like, all states are doing things for self-interested purposes. What the Chinese want is hegemony over East Asia, and specifically to unite China and Taiwan. And everything that they are doing is setting the ground to try and make that happen. I think that would be a catastrophe for the U.S. economy and for U.S. relations in Asia, which I think is the most important region in the entire world. Hence why I'm broadly opposed to much of our aid, both to Ukraine and to our role across the Atlantic Ocean, because I think Europe is a dying society, slowing GDP, not going to be important nearly as much so as it is in 100 years as opposed to the Asia Pacific. And so everything that they are doing is basically trying to replicate what we did all through 1945 and onward, brokering these peace deals, you know, and recreating the type of diplomacy. Listen, we didn't do it for benevolent reasons either. We did it also to expand the American economic empire. That's the exact same reason that they want to do it. And so watching this, really what it is it shows to me how foolish the neolib view that the Biden administration, the Atlantic worship that they have had, both of NATO and of aid to Ukraine, and the tremendous danger and opening that they have left us to by abandoning all pretense of realism in any of this conflict. And so to watch this happen, I mean, multipolarity was not a joke. It actually led to a lot of wars across the world. I'm not necessarily saying that unipolarity doesn't have its downsides either, but we shouldn't close our eyes as to what, like, a new, more unstable world is going to look like. And, you know, in this case, it can be positive, but it can also be very negative.
Well, I mean, we've played ourselves is the bottom line. I think Tricha's point here is really critical, that we are co-belligerents in terms of the Ukraine war. We're co-belligerents in terms of Yemen. So, of course, that complicates and disrupts our ability to serve as a credible peacemaker in either of these regions and in any of these conflicts. So what he ends with here is that Washington should avoid a scenario where regional players view America as an entrenched war maker and China as a flexible peacemaker. And that is exactly the direction that we're headed in right now.
Another thing that's so embarrassing, we have spent billions of hundreds of billions on Saudi Arabia. They did this in the full knowledge that it would make Biden and America look like a fool, like a second-rate power. What are we doing supporting these people? They're beyond their barbaric society. Why are we doing this for any positive reason?
What are we getting out of it?
We are selling them weapons while they flip us the bird. It's like, you know, in Iraq, you know, look, we spent what, $5 trillion in Iraq? They turned around and signed a deal, an economic deal with the Chinese. It's like, you can't even make this stuff up in terms of the level of support that we've provided to them. And they'll stab you in the front. They don't even care. And it's one of those where I can't blame them. I'd probably do the same thing if I had such a foolish person who was willing to give me so much money and then also not actually bring any of its real power to bear for our own interests and just basically taken for a ride in terms of lobbyists. So look, bottom line, this is a big deal. This is a very big deal. And if it does develop, it will represent a major sea change in international relations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Hey guys, ready or not, 2024 is fully upon us now. And Saagar and I have been brainstorming ways that we can really up our game for this critical election.
Yeah, we rely on our premium subs to expand our coverage, to add staff, to upgrade the studio. We just want to give you the best independent coverage of this election, which is possible. So if you can help us out, become a premium subscriber today, breakingpoints.com, or the link is down here in the description video. It really means the world to us. And if you like what we're all about, this is the best possible way to keep us 100% independent, working only for you.